I was wondering what your thoughts were on the last part of that story where it refers to Jesus, growing in favor with God and like learning more too. I always found that passage really perplexing, especially with like trying to balance out, well, isn't he God? But he's human as well. It's like, how do you make sense of that, or start to make sense of that?
Well, first of all, I'll say you're in good company for the last 2,000 years of Christians that have tried to figure out how exactly this works. What's the relationship? I mean, we have all kinds of fancy theological terms to describe this. Homoousios, the idea that Jesus is a combination of, human and divine all at once. So it's fine to wrestle with these things and wonder how that evolves. I think we have to be honest with ourselves that the incarnation is difficult because you have a God who has emptied God's self of a lot of the attributes that we assign to the divine. Jesus is no longer omnipresent. He's now in a tiny little body. He's no longer omnipotent. Now he is dependent on a mother for nurturing him, for caring for him, protecting him. And also, you can't have a real human experience where you are omniscient. You can't be human and know everything. Jesus can't, as a child, understand galaxies and universes. He has to learn and he has to grow those things. He has to learn a language. He doesn't even know how to speak until his mother teaches him. And so I think there's something in there about what do we mean when we talk about God? Is the most important thing to us about God omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence? Is it those big omni ideas? If it is, then I think the incarnation presents a real problem. If we can reconceptualize God to God is love, God is being, God is existence, and in that we experience something of the divine, then I think it becomes a lot more easy to say, okay, now God is present in this tiny little baby. But it does force us to reconceptualize some of our thoughts around God. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about incarnation, is it doesn't let us remain with this hyper man with a big beard and a lightning bolt in the sky. It forces us to grapple with the idea of what do we mean by God? What do we mean by the divine? And how can that concept be present in a helpless little baby? I actually think it's incredibly mysterious. I think it's one of the most important things in Christianity, though.
I love your question, and I want to tell you about something that sort of happened to me with this text. Every time I read it, all day and in my preparation, that verse in particular, I almost had like a physical response to it. Like I felt, it might sound a bit weird, but I just felt myself wanting to stretch myself across it. Like I would have to almost contain myself reading it in front of all these people, like, don't get carried away, Bobby. But I think my body was responding to something, and maybe there's this deep knowing in the ways that we carry something of the divine in us that I just do not want that verse or this mystery to become smaller. I want it to keep getting bigger. I want to keep stretching it. So something I'm deeply committed to in my teaching voice is to open these stories up, not to reduce them. So I think the fact that you're like, but I still don't really, not good. I'd say good. Let's continue to let our humanity do something of a stretching and expanding into, the word I used was into the paradox of these things don't go together in my head. I'd say good.
Do you see, is there a point in the story, or maybe you can expand to a little bit more of the surrounding text, is there a place where you see hints of Mary and Joseph sort of getting who Jesus is? You talk about Jesus getting who he is, but do you see hints of it in this text, or do you see it in an adjoining or adjacent story?
Yeah, there's not a lot of specifics in here. I mean, Bobby pointed out, this is kind of it that we have as a little glimpse between birth narratives and Jesus shows up for his public ministry and teaching. What I would say, though, is all through the Gospels, we're seeing a Jesus who is growing and becoming and understanding himself in new ways. We see that from the infant to this boy. I have argued this before. I think we see this through the life of Jesus, that he starts off in the Sermon on the Mount, giving some good advice, and he slowly starts telling parables about seeds that have to fall to the ground and die before they can bring new life. There's an evolution happening. So all I can say with that is if that is happening in Jesus throughout the story, as he's coming to his awareness of his mission and who he is and how he's connected to the divine and how he's revealing God to us, I can only surmise that that same awareness must have been happening in Mary and Joseph all the way along. Clearly, there's promises made to Mary, promises made to Joseph, but I don't think they can tap into the scale of that just from those promises. I think that is a thing they had to walk out bit by bit, and they had to see a bit more of Jesus, and they had to grow into that the same way that he had to grow into that. But I'm just speculating on that. I just imagine if the gospel writers want us to see that in Jesus, they must want us to see that in his family and his friends and the people around him. But
I had a neat conversation with someone today who was reflecting back their experience of a parent. And I'm not a parent, so I really loved hearing what he had to say. And he said, it made me think about memories of my own kids. And I'm looking back, even while you were talking, Bobby, and I could see, this moment didn't seem like such a big deal, but now I can see it in my kid's life. Like, that was a very big deal. So I think we can kind of layer the experience of parenting onto Mary and Joseph. Like, they aren't just the particulars of themselves. They also are offered to us in the Gospels and in our sacred imagination as something more. But I really loved this idea that maybe this parent didn't know it at the time, what a big moment that was, but he looked back over his kid's life and could see it. But I also think that's what happens to us in faith. Like, we can be just going along or in a tough time, and it's like, I get it now. There's something so sacredly woven into that part of my story that when I was in it, I don't know why, I just missed it, but I could look back. So, our faith is never just this moment. There's so much of it still being offered to us from the past of our own stories, I think.